Welcome to all of you who are joining us. This event is organized by Harvard Alumni for Mental Health. I'm Marie Christine Nitze, and I'm the president of HUM, the little nickname of Harvard Alumni for Mental Health. We organize events that have to do with mental health, coping, and wellness, with the idea that we can all help strengthen our communities to cope with the difficulties, challenges, and adversity that may come their way. And I'm sure that if you're like me, you've watched some of the events of the Olympics and asked yourself, how do they get coached into resisting the pressure of all of the media, the attention, the peak performance they're trying to achieve, all of the stress and anxiety that probably surrounds this experience? And we thought the same thing at Harvard Alumni for Mental Health. And we thought, you know what, perhaps we can ask the pros. We can ask those who help those athletes and who can help us channel those coping strategies and our inner athletes as well in our own life. And so for tonight's event, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Caifeng Zhu, who is our Director of Community Programs and who is going to be your host tonight and introduce our speaker. We thank all of you for attending. I welcome you, and I'm going to let Dr. Zhu now introduce our speaker. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Dr. Nitze. Marie Christine Nitze is the president of HUM, and I believe Dr. Nitze has introduced a little bit about HUM. It's not really HUM, H-A-R-M. No, not at all. It's Harvard Alumni for Mental Health and for Well-being, which was founded in 2014, I believe. Okay, so I am Caifeng Zhu, or Zhu Caifeng in Chinese. I have the honor of to become the director of the community service of HUM, H-A-R-H-A-M-H. And today we have a guest, very special guest, kind of coinciding with the ongoing Winter Olympic Games in China. And Kyle Bissell is going to be our speaker. And here is his basic introduction. I'm going to introduce him, and after that, he will give us a 30 minutes or so presentation, followed by Q&A. Okay, Kyle Bissell, he's a coach and lives in Greenfield, Massachusetts, with his wife and 2 daughters. He holds a master's degree in education, and he's also currently a student, PhD student, in the Integrated Health Sciences track at Rocky Mountain University of Health Professions. He is an international team staff member of USA Archery, and he is a head coach for US Archery's regional elite development program on the East Coast. Bissell presents at national coaching conferences and collaborates with the Olympic archery coach to train level 4 national coaches. Coach Kyle founded Sattva Center at archery training for archery training in 2011 to help a young child recover from a concussion. Today, Sattva has 8 staff and trains over 1,000 athletes and coaches annually. Kyle has studied and applied the art and the science of teaching movement for 28 years across various fields, ranging from physical education with elementary school students to advanced education programs for colleges across New England, including Harvard and College of the Atlantic. Ski magazine named Bissell one of the top 75 best instructors for children in the United States. And that was based on the survey in 1997. A recent book called We Are Crew column, a teamwork approach to school culture, published in 2020, highlights Bissell's custom archery-based professional development program in a case study. All right, this is a very rich and a very sound introduction of our guest speaker today. So without much ado, I'm going to leave the time space to Kyle, Mr. Bissell. Please.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming out this evening to listen to what I want to present. And thanks as well. I see so many names in the room right now that I recognize from Sattva, and even there, Chandler, I see you on there from North Carolina. So glad you made it. So thanks everybody for coming out. I'm really glad to share this evening with you. So to begin, if everyone could turn off their microphones just so there's no feedback on my end, that'd be great. And I think it's important to note that what I present to you tonight is from my perspective only as a USA archery coach and coach trainer, but it's also from the perspective of an athlete, because I'm also an athlete. I've competed in ultra marathons and triathlons of all distances. So I want to be clear that while my experiences might generalize to some portion of the population, my perceptions of stress and coping with stress are void of considerations for what it's like to experience, consistent hunger, for example, or food insecurity, or live in a war zone, experience PTSD, things like that. So the realm of stress that I'll be speaking about tonight is more germane to the background that I've had. So I just want to be sensitive to that and clear about that before we move forward. Now, when I talk about stress tonight, I'm talking about the physiological reactivity of to certain stimuli. Might result in anger, fear, helplessness, loss of control, loss of sense of control, or on the other end of the spectrum, it could also evoke a sense of thrill, inspiration, and tenacity. So it's important. Another piece that's important to understand is a little bit more about my background. That is that I have a background in adventure education, which is where Stephen Butler comes in, who's here this evening. So the work of Kurt Hahn, who founded Outward Bound, Paul Petzold, who's the founder of the National Outdoor Leadership School, Carl Ronke, and Stephen Butler. These are people who were highly influential to me in teaching me the concept that challenge is needed for growth, and that we need challenge. And challenge is accompanied by stress, and that stress does not need to be feared. That in fact, we can adapt to stress, and the more we put ourselves in situations that are stressful, we can begin to become more comfortable in those situations. I, similar to you, Stephen, have a fear of heights. And one of the ways that I didn't overcome my fear of heights, but I got more comfortable with it, certainly experienced less stress by being on challenge courses, being in trees, conducting programs that were adventure education based. So just that's a little bit about more about me. There's an analogy that I picked up somewhere along the way in adventure education that I want to preface the rest of the evening with, and it really highlights the fact that the rest of what you're going to hear me talk about tonight is not about removing stress from your life, or that stress is bad, but that how we can capitalize on stress, how we can use stress as a means towards optimal performance. So the story is this. Picture a tree in the field. It's a baby tree. It's tiny. It's just taking root. And it's in a field that has no exposure to wind. It gets all the nutrients it needs. Water is always plentiful for it. It's just these ideal conditions. And it grows up so rapidly and perfectly straight with no stress at all. Well, then one day, a storm comes along. Stress comes knocking on its door. And that tree's roots are going to be so shallow because food was always handed to it and the water's always right there. That tree's going to get uprooted and fall right over. It was not prepared to deal with stress. So in thinking about our lives, or the athletes' lives, the athletes that I work with, I think of us like trees, and that we need to kind of measure out the amounts of stress. As a coach, I measure out the amounts of stress I put on my athletes to try to make sure their roots are growing deeply, so they're going to be prepared for stressors that come ahead. Okay. Now, a good friend of mine reflected that I tend to approach challenges and stress with abundance opposed to scarcity. And this is a key notion in moving forward as well tonight. Now, the first section that I want to talk about is a section about salutogenesis and how salutogenesis connects with stress management. So I'm imagining that most of you have never heard of salutogenesis. So let me get into it a little bit. So Aaron Antonovsky wrote a book in 1979, I believe, titled Health, Stress, and Coping. And in this book, he suggested that the way in which people view their life impacts the quality of their health and well-being. He observed that people are always exposed to risk, challenge, chaos, stress, and potentially anxiety-producing stimuli. And furthermore, he suggested that it would be healthier to actively adapt to those stressors by focusing on well-being and health promotion compared to the predominant healthcare model that focused on risk factors. So enter Antonovsky's theory of salutogenesis. And salutogenesis is an assets-based approach to health and well-being. Now, what do I mean by assets-based approach to health and well-being? Well, Lindstrom and Erickson in 2010 developed a visual depiction of salutogenesis as an umbrella with a host of salutogenic supporting assets under that umbrella. Now, as I run through just a few of these assets under the salutogenesis umbrella, I want you to consider the value each asset has in managing stress to you. Okay, so as I list off these words, just consider, like, imagine yourself in a stressful situation, and then imagine how you might respond differently to the situation if the asset I mentioned was at your disposal in abundance. Okay, hopefully I was clear with that. So self-efficacy, a la Bandura. Empathy, Eisenberg. Coping, a la Lazarus, if any of you are familiar. Learned hopefulness, sense of understanding of the situation. Resilience, inner strength, which happens to be one of the meanings of sattva, the name of my business. Humor, locus of control, post-traumatic personal growth, empowerment, and flow. So when you think of those words, I don't know about you, but I know when I hear those words and I try to apply them to a stressful situation, like, okay, these are the tools that I have in abundance at my resource or at my fingertips to use as resources in working through this stressful situation. I feel empowered. I feel like I can succeed. And suddenly I've interacted with my resources and my environment in a way where my perceived level of stress, it has diminished. So maybe my heart rate's come down, maybe my Palmer sweat index has decreased, and I'm just enjoying life more. And that's always good. So finally, I want to add to this list that those two authors added, Lindstrom and Erickson. I couldn't remember their names. I want to add growth mindset to that list of assets, because I personally I can think of specific situations I've been in that were very stressful, and certainly were set up and designed. Now that I look back on them, they were designed to get me to fail. And I excelled in those situations because I had the resource I had the asset of a growth mindset. Okay, and that's growth mindset. If any of you are familiar with that or not familiar with that, that's Carol Dweck. So if you want to follow up with that after this, I highly recommend looking at Carol Dweck's research and books on growth mindset. I want to draw a picture for you now in your minds that will help you understand how salutogenesis intersects with a stressful stimulus and the impact that assets like the ones I just mentioned have on an individual's lived experience as an athlete or otherwise. So picture a continuum with pathogenesis on one end of the continuum, all right? And I want you to picture salutogenesis on the other. Pathogenic orientation is one that sees health and disease as a dichotomy, not as a continuum. Pathogenic orientation focuses on risk factors, not health and well-being. Pathogenic orientation sees stress as strictly pathogenic, disease-causing, whereas salutogenic orientation acknowledges that stress and tension could have neutral or even salutary impacts on health and well-being. All right, so pathogenic orientation seeks a magic bullet to solve illness, whereas salutogenic orientation promotes active adaptation. So we have two very different paradigms here. And what I'm presenting to you tonight really falls under this salutogenic paradigm. All right, back to this picture we were drawing in our head. So we've got pathogenesis on one end and salutogenesis on the other. All right, everyone with me? Now, picture that continuum and place an X, maybe just somewhere in the middle on that continuum. An X marks the spot. That X represents a stressful event that creates tension in your life and potentially dis-ease. All right. At the moment the individual breaks down and feels overwhelmed by that stress, perhaps overcome by anxiety, doubt, fear, then their mental landscape is headed towards the end of the continuum associated with pathogenesis. All right. But however, if in that moment, the athlete or the individual identifies all the resources they have, their abundance, however creative it needs to be, they can identify the assets they have to problem solve through the stressful situation and thereby continue in the direction toward the other end of the continuum, salutogenesis. Okay, so I have an example here for you. All right, so in archery, the pathogenic end of the continuum is also associated with focusing on outcome. And the salutogenic end of the continuum is associated with focusing on process. So focusing on outcome in archery leads to increased anxiety at best and performance blocks that completely debilitate the athlete at worst. In archery, we call that target panic. Now I have another example as well. So the moment of decision-making is sort of like taking an exit ramp on a highway. So imagine yourself going through life or going through an archery tournament or a training session, and suddenly a stressful event comes up where you experience tension. Well, in that moment, you have a choice to make. You can have a choice to make. You can also feel like you don't have a choice, but you can make a choice to go one way or the other. And one is staying on that highway of stress or to get off the exit ramp. All right, you either take it or you don't. This is a very, at least I see it as a very dichotomous situation, right? It takes a concerted effort and skill to manage that stress in that moment and choose to review what your resources are, identify your assets, and remain solution-oriented. It takes inner strength, which remember, that's one of the meanings of sattva, the word behind me here. There's the S right there, okay? The name of our training center. So it also takes mental toughness. And the US Olympic coach, Kissick Lee, defines mental toughness. I love this definition. So he defines it as the ability to aggressively fall back on process in the face of adversity. And that process he's talking about is the shot cycle, the steps, the choreography that we go through, that the elite athletes go through when shooting an arrow. To the untrained eye, it looks like they raise the bow, pull the string back, and let it rip. But there's a whole series of steps. It's a choreography, and remaining focused on process is the key. Focus on outcome, even for a second, it breaks that process, and it allows anxiety, doubt, and maybe even elements of self-perfectionism to seep in, or concern for how others might perceive your performance to seep in, and now you'll tank. Okay. All right, so that's salutogenesis. The next piece I want to talk about are, I'm going to call them stress bubbles and kind of the concept of cumulative stress. And so I'm going to talk about stress bubbles in a way that I've seen attentional capacity talked about before. Attentional capacity looks at how attentional demands impact attentional resources. So for example, you may be able to walk on a treadmill and read a magazine, but what happens to your performance when you try to walk on a treadmill, read a magazine, and watch TV? Your performance on one or more of those areas is going to go down. So what I'm about to say is not based on research, but I have seen, I believe this to be true because of my own experiences. And here it is. The accumulation of stress impacts performance in similar way to the way accumulation of demands for attention impact performance. All right, so here are the bubbles, the stress bubbles that I've identified. Right. Financial. We each have a financial bubble. Academic. If you're still in school, you've got an academic bubble. Family. Social. Athletic pursuit. Maybe you do that, maybe you don't. But if you're doing that, and that's the purpose, that's my focus, right? Work. Spiritual, political, and maybe you have other ones as well. But each one of those bubbles can contain so much stress. And they're all in the same bucket as well, which is you. It's your person. You can only experience so much stress. So if you're an athlete and you experience overwhelming amounts of stress, say in your financial life, and combined with your personal life, your family life, then you might be close to capacity with the amount of extra stress you could possibly take in from your training regimen. So that's something that I have to consider as a coach very closely. My point is that if an athlete is experiencing stress in their social life, family life, financial life, they are going to have less capacity for the inherent stressors involved with training or competing at a high level. And the impacts of overtraining might be experienced earlier. So a coach who's not aware of this might say, I see lower motivational levels in this person. I see all the markers for overtraining, but they're really not training that hard. What's going on? So I must consider the whole athlete, not just the training plan, but the lived experience of the athlete. Anxiety and stress experienced off the field does not necessarily stay off the field. Some people can compartmentalize, even if you think you can. I still think that it impacts the athlete's whole being, all right? Underlying anxiety, past trauma, trauma-like experiences, they fill up our stress bubbles and impact how much stress we can tolerate in our training situation, okay? I had an athlete I worked with who was experiencing a decrease of performance for a period of a year. And I just to be completely upfront and honest, I'm going to change. This is a slightly, I'm changing the details of this story slightly. So, but they had a car accident, surgery, and COVID had happened all around the same time. And that soon after that, they developed performance block. So an inability to perform the shot cycle, an inability to continue and execute the shot the way it's supposed to. They weren't able to go through the choreography, all right? And to an archer, that can be debilitating. Your performance goes down tremendously. Now, I did not consider the whole athlete at the time. I really focused on process and the details just within the choreography. But once I was able to gather a bigger picture and look at the whole athlete is when we started to see elements of this target panic, elements of this performance block slip away, and we could see performance increase again. So that's an example of how the whole person needs to be considered when you're experiencing a performance decrease in some area of your life. It might not necessarily be that area of your life that needs attention, right? In fact, you may need to back away and say, what else is going on? Okay, the next area I want to talk about are coping strategies. And so I primarily promote what is often referred to as an approach style or proactive style of coping strategy. And I generally do not recommend avoidance strategies for coping with stress. However, I'm open to the idea that avoidance strategies may have value in the short term with very specific contexts where stress stimuli is so much larger than the individual is capable of managing. Okay. I believe I've used it successfully in my life, and I've also used that in tournament situations where the clock was ticking, and I guided athletes to purposely avoid the stress and block it out and focus on something else that they had control over, because the stress stimulus was something they did not have control over. And so that's an example of where avoidance might be an appropriate coping strategy. And also in the sporting world, there is mixed studies. There are netball studies that show avoidance associated with, I'll be specific here. There's netball studies that show avoidance coping strategies associated with high performance. But on the other hand, there's elite golf players that show an association between choking under pressure and the using of avoidance coping strategies. So there's really evidence both ways. That being said, again, at 99% of the time, I am leaning towards what's called an approach style of coping or proactive style of coping strategy. So let me go over both of those. So an approach style of coping approach coping strategy involves dealing with the stress once the stimulus takes place. Okay, so you experience a stress and your heart rate goes up. Maybe you begin sweating. Maybe blood pressure changes. Maybe your mind starts racing and you start to feel like you're losing control of the situation, and like your assets or your resources are at a scarcity rather than an abundance. Well, deep breathing can help that. Oh, I forget the numbers now, but I believe it's 3 deep breaths. Maybe one of the archers in the audience remembers better than I, but I think it's 3 deep breaths cut adrenaline by 30%. And so that's a trick of Olympic archers. When they step out onto the stage, their heart rate is going at about 160 beats per minute when they step out onto the stage. All right, that's what my heart rate gets to when I am pushing it on the bike. That's like the top of my zone 4, I think. Right between my zone 4 and zone 5 for my heart rate. Or when I'm running at a steady clip for a while. You know, so deep breathing can really cut that adrenaline. And it has to in archery. When that adrenaline is cut, it allows you to manage your arousal level and become more aware of your arousal level. And when we can manage our arousal level, we can reach a state of optimal performance. The goal isn't to be relaxed. We don't want to be relaxed as an athlete. All right. So, you know, I know this is different than like managing stress with meditation or yoga, where you want to reach this state of deep relaxation. I actually know nothing about that. My whole world is about embracing optimal levels of stress to perform at high levels. That's how I function. And that's how the athletes I work with function. So visualization is another coping strategy, approach style coping strategy that I have an example for later on. Flow triggers are also an approach style coping strategy. So the element of having choice, okay? Listening to certain music. eye tracking activities combined with rapid response. So for instance, there's times with my athletes, I'll warm them up, their back will be facing me. I will have a ball and I will throw a ball in the air in a big arc and say, turn. They have to turn, face me, find the ball in the air and catch it, throw it back to me and then spin around again. And we just do that over and over and over again. And that's, there's about 20 of these elements that are considered flow triggers that we integrate regularly into Sattva's training sessions. Meditation is also an approach style. And I also identify, I don't see other people mention this in the literature, but I consider nutrition to be an approach style to coping strategy as well. Because like when I was, there was a professional triathlete that gave me this advice. She said, Kyle, she said, if you're ever competing, this was as a triathlete, she said, if you're ever competing and you notice your stress level go up and your attitude go down, she said, the first thing I want you to consider is nutrition. And so that's why this is in there, is because remember, the definition of approach style coping was that it's something you do, it's a strategy that you do once the stimulus takes place. So there you are running along or biking or swimming, and you're like, oh man, life is awful. Why am I here? I'm falling behind. You know, your self-talk just tanks. And first thing to consider is, hey, where's my nutrition? When's the last time I had intake of food or water? Okay. And then mental toughness, I think, is also another approach style. You can remind yourself, there's a little saying I say to my athletes when I notice them heading towards the way of a pathogenic response rather than a salutogenic response. And I get right in their face and I say, listen, you know, I know you pretty well, and right now you're faced with a challenge and you need mental toughness to face that challenge. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to envision that challenge as a person, and I want you to shake that person's hand. And I shake their hand. And I said, I want you to squeeze a little bit more hard, like a little bit more than what's socially acceptable. And I said, so go ahead, squeeze my hand hard. And they do. And then I said, and I want you to look that person right in the eye, that challenge. I want you to look them in the eye. And I want you to say, hi, my name is so-and-so. You better get to know me because I'm about to eat you for lunch. Right? So in that, they have to adapt and adopt this persona that may feel a little humorous in that situation, a little awkward, but it's always worked for me when I've chosen to use it. I haven't used it with every athlete, but it's an intuition. I'll read the situation and be like, okay, they need to shake Challenge's hand and tell Challenge that it's actually up for a challenge. Challenge needs to prepare for the challenge of them beating them. and that's when it happens. And they have a breakthrough. So I've experienced the stress of 2 performance blocks in my lifetime with 2 different sports. One with rock climbing because of my debilitating fear of heights. And I mean debilitating. I ended up in the glass elevator at the Basketball Hall of Fame once, not by choice. You're funneled right into there. And I was with my daughter and my wife at the time. And I didn't realize we were in a glass elevator, and it just sends you up and you're inside the basketball that is the museum. And I remember just hitting the floor and curling up in a ball because I had no choice, right? So I wasn't able, my element, I had no locus of control. I wasn't aware it was about to happen. I could not prepare myself. And that was the only instance that I've ever had that type of response from height. And so I gave myself empathy in that moment, which I think is also a really important aspect of dealing with and coping with stress. Empathy for yourself and empathy for those around you. So the other example I want to give you is about swimming. And so I took 13 years of swim lessons, never passed intermediate level. I wanted to do triathlon since I was about 7 years old because I was a great runner and a great biker, but I couldn't swim. I could swim. I could make it across the pool. People say, hey, you look great. But when I would get to the other side of the pool, the lifeguard would meet me there and say, can I help you? Because my heart rate would be jacked so high. And I would be, my anxiety level would just be through the roof. And I didn't understand why. I loved water. I loved playing around water. I grew up on a lake in the summer times. I loved water, but I couldn't swim in the way that brought me joy. It was very anxiety producing. So I taught myself to swim. That's a long story, but I would still start triathlons and have debilitating moments of anxiety where I would have to tread water, and my self-talk was really tragic. It was violent. I was violent towards myself, where I would say things like, you suck, you're going to die, no one's going to know about it because you're going to be underneath these thousands of people that are around you. It just went on and on and on. And I would have to tread water over to the side and let, hundreds of people pass me, and then slowly choose to take a few strokes, come up. I would think about going back, but I never gave up. And then I eventually would keep going. And it never got better until my mother said, Kyle, I want you to visualize yourself as an otter playing amongst all these people. And so that's what I did. And so I did several full distance Ironman and half Ironman after that, where there's literally 2,500 people in the water around you in the open water. And I would have anxiety and stress that normally would have led to me coming up out of the water, treading water, hyperventilating before I could control myself and continuing on. I could feel the stress escalating while I'm still swimming. And then I would say, okay, mom said, and visualize yourself as an otter playing. What does that look like? Okay, well, first of all, otters smile. Okay, second of all, otters are like quick and movement, and they have good energy. They don't have like sluggish energy. So all of a sudden, my whole persona would change in order to fulfill this vision of playing like an otter. And so visualization is also a great way of dealing with stress. And in my case, some debilitating stress around swimming. All right, so that's the approach style of coping. Now, proactive style involves strategies where you're preventing the stress stimulus altogether. So for example, prepping for indoor nationals. Indoor nationals is this massive event where, not as big as outdoor nationals, but because it's indoors, it feels really big. And so imagine you've never been to an archery tournament, and then you go to indoor nationals for the first time, which for some reason, going to indoor nationals seems to be this really provocative attraction for people, and especially kids. They won't go to any smaller tournaments first, and they're like, I'm going to nationals. And they end up going to indoor nationals. They walk in, there's 80 people shooting at once, and then those 80 step back and 80 more people step up. And you're really close together. You couldn't fit a third person between the two people standing next to each other. Hope that made sense. So one thing we do as a proactive, something I do as a proactive coping strategy, is show people who have never been to indoor nationals pictures of what indoor nationals looks like. Hey, this is how many people are going to be there. Here's a video I took last year. Then I really try to get them to go to smaller tournaments and slowly increase the size of the tournament so that they are that potential stress they'll experience. Because I've seen people almost pass out. I've seen people break down to tears and start trembling when they walk into nationals and they've never, been in an environment like that. So creating situations for people to experience that stimulus or actually see it in pictures or video is a proactive strategy. Okay. Now, this is the biggest proactive coping strategy that I use, and I made an acronym out of it. It's called SPEARED, and it has to do with the constraint style of teaching movements. And as I go through this, I know you're not, I know that there's some archers in the room tonight, but for those of you that are archers, I chose to keep this in my presentation because I believe that you will find meaning from it, even though it's archery specific. So that's my task for you as I speak, is to figure out how this applies to life beyond the archery field. Because I believe it does. I'm just going to tell you how it applies to archery. So speared, size of the target. We change the size of the target or the shape of the target during training practices. So we're not always shooting at the same size target, right? That helps people deal with stress later on. Physiology. We will get people doing jumping jacks, jump rope, squats, you name it. Get on the stationary bike, push-ups, sit-ups, get their heart rates elevated and fatigue their muscles in order, and then have them go shoot right away in order to mimic what it's like to experience the stress of shooting with physical fatigue and, elevated heart rate. Okay, so that's physiology. E is for environment. Change the environment. If we have athletes who are just always shoot in perfect conditions, they're not going to be prepared for rainy weather. They're not going to be prepared for sun in their face. They're not going to be prepared for cold or wind, things like that. So we need to create opportunities in our training environments that mimic these adverse conditions, because that's proactively preparing the athletes to deal with these stresses, okay? And they then develop their own coping strategies that they bring with them to tournaments when they go to compete. And then when it's windy, they're not stressed at all because they have the asset in hand, okay? Angle, we'll even change the angle of the target. We have the athletes shoot in different rhythms. We'll have athletes change equipment. There's a little finger sling. Most people don't realize this, but in archery, there's two releases. You release the string, that's clear, but you also release the bow. And those two actions need to happen simultaneously. And there's a finger sling that makes it so the bow doesn't just drop on the ground. It catches the bow. Now, I had an athlete once that was at a major national event, and they lost their finger sling. Now, a finger sling can be made out of any shoelace or a piece of fabric. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And there were, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of spectators that had shoelaces. But my athlete, I wasn't there. They were on their own. This down in Florida at the Gator Cup, and they lost their finger sling, and their performance just tanked. They were in the top 5, lost their finger sling, went downhill. They tanked, and I think they came in like 30th or something, which was great. But they were in the top 5 and on target to keep climbing. They weren't able to come back after that stress of losing their finger sling. So when that athlete got back to me, I realized that I had failed that athlete and not prepared them for the stress of having equipment malfunctions, which is a reality of life. There's a story, it's a story of, I believe it was a US compound athlete who went to Italy to compete in a major world tournament, and the airplanes lost all of this man's luggage, including his bow, uniform, everything. The person he was staying with in Italy gave him a spare bow, and the officials let the athlete compete in shorts and a t-shirt that were like, what he wore on the airplane, even though it was against regulation. And he made a quiver out of tin cans that he found in recycling. He ended up coming in, I think it was like 2nd or 3rd. This was with a bow and arrows that he's never shot. It's not tuned to him. And yeah, so, I mean, amazing, absolutely amazing. That's an example of someone that was prepared, had used proactive styles. Most likely, I'm guessing that their coach used proactive styles of coping strategies to prepare that athlete for losing equipment. Okay. Great. Let's see. I want to talk about stress appraisal coping theory. Some of you might know this. Lazarus and Folkman. This is a 1984. because it aligns best with how I prefer to guide athletes. So stress appraisal suggests that coping is a process that takes place between the person and their environment in an attempt by the individual to meet the demands of the environment. So in other words, coping is an effort to reduce stress or make the intolerable nature of the situation more tolerable. So now an individual's character, along with how skillful they are at managing stress, impacts how an individual appraises a stressful situation. So appraisal is a cognitive process. In this case, one of the constructs being appraised by the individual is their very own skill set. So do they have the resources to manage the stress? And that's one of the pieces that I do as a coach, is I want my athletes to be able to get to yes and manage that stress.
All right, Kyle, we need to leave some time for Q&A. I know you have a lot of stories to share.
No problem.
Thank you so much, Kyle. So Taifang, would you like then to invite our audience to unmute and to ask any follow-up questions? And perhaps, Kyle,
yes,
you can take
yes,
it.
I just want to make sure, Kyle, you have come to a sort of end, kind of can wrap it up. Is that okay? Is that, or do you need to wrap it up with a few more sentences, a few more words before we transition to the Q&A?
Would that be okay with you if I wrapped it up with a few more words?
Sure, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think I'll close with this. So it's my job as a coach to prepare athletes for stress in such a way that their self-image grows. So in athletics, self-image equals performance. And I think that's true off the field as well. So I want my athletes to be able to have an awareness of when they are in stressful situations and then make meaning from those stressful situations. And this concept of making space and making meaning from the stressful situations is to appraise the situation. What's going on is referred to as sense of coherence, or SOC. And this concept of SOC, or sense of coherence, will be someone with a strong sense of coherence is more likely to appraise or evaluate a situation that's potentially stressful. They're going to evaluate it as neutral compared to someone who has a weak SOC. So appraising a situation as neutral means the individual athlete will experience less stress. And that's a skill that we can all apply in our own lives. I'll end with a quick story. I jumped out of an airplane, my first time jumping out of an airplane, and my parachute failed. And in that moment, I had a strong SOC. So I had a very strong sense of coherence. So in other words, I made meaning of the situation rapidly, identified my assets, and figured out what I was going to do about that. And I saw my backup chute as an asset. So I didn't deploy it. I waited because I had an altimeter, and I used the time that I had until that minimum zone where you have to pull your chute to solve the problem. I engaged with the problem despite my fear of heights, and I was able to make meaning of the situation, solve the problem, and fix it before I got to 1,000 feet. So that's an example of SOC. I think that's something we can all work on in our lives. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I wish we had another hour for you to go on. That's a fascinating story to wrap it up with. Parachute and work it out during maybe, I don't know, 20 seconds problem solving, and they succeeded. Thank you very much, Kyle, again, for the wonderful and very concrete information and stories. We have about 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes. I would like to invite any of the audience. If you have a question, please, you can, I would suggest you just open your mic and speak to Kyle directly.
Okay, I have a question. 7岁的儿子问的问题，我每次听讲座都会问，您的梦想是什么？谢谢。
Okay, I'm sorry that she was presenting in Chinese and asking me to help her to translate. I don't know whether I can do it. Basically, she has a friend who is also a parachuting athlete. And this audience, Li Bo, was asking, how could you do it? How could you do it? How can you be successful in your athletic competition? And the athlete says, well, what I'm doing, Li Bo, you can tell me whether I'm correct. And the athlete seems to be listening to music as a way to enhance his competition state, I would say. The art, that's listening to music seems to be the strategy or the approach for the athlete to cope with the stress.
There's a book called I believe it's called The Rise of the Super Athlete or The Rise of Superman. I can't remember who the author is. Maybe if someone's on the internet right now, you can look it up, The Rise of Superman. And that book looks at flow, and a lot of really fascinating research, in my opinion, is happening and has happened in the past 20 years on flow to really expand the original model or theory. So music is a flow trigger, and much of what we know about flow and how we've studied flow has come out of the higher risk adventure-based sports, like what you're saying with I think you were saying it was your friend who is the skydiver. So that makes a lot of sense to me, that the music helps them find flow. Yeah, and flow, for anyone that isn't familiar, is if you picture, one axis being like level of challenge, and another axis, the other axis being skill level. Flow is the state where from the origin directly up at a 45-degree angle, you have this perfect balance of the amount of challenge coming at you relative to the amount of skill you have to put towards that challenge. So if you're too skillful and there's not enough challenge, well, you're bored. And if there's too much challenge and you don't have enough skill, well, then you have anxiety and stress.
Yeah.
So that's flow. And your question about the music, or your observation about the music, is very appropriately placed. Thank you for your question.
Right. So let's see if there's another question. We have we're just arriving at the limit of the time, but we can extend maybe a few more minutes if there are additional questions. Please feel free. Let's take a couple of more questions.
There's a question I found that came in the chat that I'm happy to read if it helps.
Please,
Kyle,
yeah.
Can you please share more about how to help with negative self-talk?
Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Negative self-talk.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Libo, for your question earlier. So my first, empathy, self-empathy would be my first suggestion. And really taking space to sit with yourself and just give yourself some love and acknowledge the fact that it takes place, that you don't like it, and then envision what you want to replace that with. So remember my negative self-talk, which I consider very violent towards myself. I've never like that. There's no other situation in my life that I've been that violent to myself compared to the talk that I give myself when I'm swimming, and then start to have what probably is an anxiety attack. And the only way I found through that for myself was to give myself empathy, breathe deeply, to give kind of decentralize myself from the situation, and then begin to visualize myself playing as an otter. So for me, I didn't come up with that solution of playing as an otter. My mother came up with that. Mm-hmm. I think this is where it's really important to have a support structure and have people that you can talk with about this as well, that know you and can help you through this, because you might not come up with a solution, someone else might. And it's going to be very specific to you. My mother knows that I'm very connected with nature. So that visualization really helped me.
Great.
I don't know if that helps, but that's, I encourage you, if you want to talk more about that, I welcome you to contact me directly, and we can talk specifically about, I can get to know you, and we can try some things out. It's trial and error as well. I did not find something that fit, was a magic bullet. Remember, there isn't going to be a magic bullet. That's more on the pathogenic side of the paradigm, but the salutogenic side of the paradigm, or the continuum rather, the salutogenic paradigm, you're going to adapt, and you have a motivation to adapt now. You don't want that negative self-talk.
Great. Well, I don't know whether we have another question ready. If not, I have one question. I want to take the advantage of being the host. Kyle, okay. Now you mentioned something very interesting to me, mental toughness as one of the approaches or strategies. Imagining the problem as a person, and you look at him in the eyes and shake his hand, and squeeze his hand a little stronger, and to get yourself ready. Now, my question is, how successful this strategy has been with your clients, your athletes? I mean, approximately, or if they don't feel like doing that, if you just shy away, what is the backup strategy for the mental toughness?
Yeah, it's a great question, because, and I'm not sure I have an answer to the last part of the question, because I've yet to have it fail. I wonder if that's partly because I read the situation, I know the athletes, and I know a little bit about their character. And I imagine to myself that I have a pretty, it's a gamble. As a coach, you take risks, you take gambles. And so I've yet to be wrong in my risk taking. I want to definitely say, I'm glad you brought it up, because I enjoy being open and honest about this. I used to study nonviolent communication. And so this idea of like personifying the challenge as a person and looking it in the eyes, and like there's part of that doesn't work for me at all, because it's like antagonistic with another person. But again, I use it it's in the context of a specific athlete. I wouldn't use that with everybody. And in another situation, I've used, there's two other athletes that I've used the visualization of let your lion roar, be a lion, right? And with the, and to me, that I'm really communicating the same thing as the handshake example, but that the let your lion roar, or if I, the athlete catches my eye and they're performing, they're at the line, they shoot a bad shot and they look back at me and I just go, roar.
Roar.
They know exactly what that means, because we've had that conversation, and I know that just evoked in them this feeling of inspiration and tenacity, which is what they need in that moment.
Tenacity, okay. Persistence or perseverance.
Yes, that's right.
Good, great. Okay, so you don't have to answer the second part. I think it sounds like very, very well formulated. And I was asking the second part of the question because me as a counselor, psychological counselor or therapist, some people have trauma in the early childhood. And something might trigger their early trauma, and then simply they shy away and scared, and they give up. Yeah. So I heard you say, it works with, not with everybody with the same approach, but I assume you have the eye, you have the ability to decide what kind of person you're going to use mental toughness, and what kind of person, in what situation you will use empathy.
That's right.
That kind of thing. So very good balance. Well,
That's right. That's the art.
That's the art.
Combining the art and the science. Yes.
Yes.
Taifang, I see we have one last question. I was wondering if we can make time for one more audience member. Kyle, Taifang, if that's okay with both of you.
I'm okay. I'm okay. How is Kyle? Okay.
And I don't want to take up too much of your time, so maybe you could point me in the direction. You mentioned those flow triggers or activities that I'd never heard of, like as a proactive approach or as an approach orientation. Where maybe I could, if you want to speak to a few of those, or maybe if there's like an author or resource that like you're referring to, I thought that kind of caught my ear, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm trying to get to the chat room right now. I can't find oh gosh, here we go. Let's see. Marie-Christine, would you be willing to type my email in the chat? And then I can send out, well, anyone who wants to could contact me and I can send them that resource. Does that work?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. And thank you so much for providing contact info. We appreciate you making yourself available to the audience members for any follow-up. We can also, in the chat, I put in a little bit earlier the email address, our Gmail address at Harvard Alumni for Mental Health. If you have any questions and you would like to get in touch with our speaker, you don't have the email, feel free to also connect with us. We'll be happy to put you in touch. So I'll put your email address in a second in the chat here, Kyle.
Great.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I encourage you to check out the book, The Rise of Superman. And again, I'm sorry, I can't remember the author. But...
Yeah, no, I've read Stephen Kotler's West of Jesus and
Perfect.
Art of Impossible are both great. So it's on the list.
Awesome.
There you go. And now your email is there. And the link to that book that you just mentioned is also in the chat.
Thanks.
All right. Yes. So it's almost it's almost 10. It's just about 10 minutes past the end of the event. So I want to thank Kyle Bissell very much for the wonderful presentation and the QA part. I personally enjoyed it very much, and I want to also thank everybody present tonight or here in China in the morning. All right, folks, I need to wrap it up and say goodbye and thank you again. Hopefully we can see each other again some other time at home.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kyle. Have a good night.